Since its founding, the United States has been a place dominated by white males. But in the 1800s, times were changing. Growing numbers protested the inhumanity of slavery, and, for the first time, there was public talk about a woman's right to vote. Against the backdrop of this revolution of ideas, hundreds of people made a journey across the country, a journey motivated by ideas of manifest destiny to a place little explored by European forces, the West. Among these travelers was 17-year-old Abigail Jane Scott. She would eventually become an influential suffragist, the author of a revolutionary newspaper, and the first female registered to vote in Oregon. She would spend her whole life fighting for women's suffrage through debate and diplomacy. She persisted through hardship failure, commemorating those oppressed before her and inspiring future generations to fight for equality. But before all of this, she was just a kid living in Illinois. Abigail was born on October 22nd, 1834. Her parents, John Tucker Scott and Anne Rothelston Scott, had 12 children. Abigail was the third born. She grew up in rural Illinois in a provincial town named Tazewell, receiving less than 1 year of formal education. At the young age of 17, Abigail, her parents, and her 9 surviving siblings packed up for Oregon, along with hundreds of others searching for a better life. Abigail was tasked with documenting their journey by keeping a daily journal. Despite her lack of education, she kept detailed records filled with vivid descriptions of the ever-changing world around them. The trip was arduous and tragic. Abigail lost her mother and one of her brothers before they even reached the West. The remaining family members arrived in Oregon in 1853 and settled in the quaint town of Lafayette. Abigail quickly got a job as a teacher, and that same year, she met and married Benjamin Duniway, changing her name to what we know her as today, Abigail Scott Duniway. They moved to a farm in Clackamas County and began a family. For 10 peaceful years, the Dunaways lived on their farm. It wasn't until 1862, after Ben suffered a paralyzing injury, that things began to change for Abigail. They moved back to Lafayette and later Portland, where Abigail became the breadwinner, teaching at a private school, taking in boarders, and running a millinery, turning out hats for 5 years. It was during this time that Abigail became increasingly frustrated by the lack of opportunities and equality women had. She had heard of the revolutionaries in the East, the ones who first began to petition for equal rights. Abigail was disheartened by the lack of action for women's suffrage in Oregon. Finally, fueled by the stories from married patrons of her shop and the growing suffrage movements around her, she decided to publish her own newspaper. So began the New Northwest, a human rights newspaper first published in 1871. It focused on controversial topics including prohibition, women's legal status, as well as treatment of the Chinese, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups in Oregon. The paper's motto: free speech, free press, free people. Through her gifted editing, writing, and activism, Abigail brought together all kinds of people in the pages of her newspaper. Many of them were suffragists, like Frances Fuller Victor, Judith Reed, and Ellen Dowd. In the summer of 1871, Abigail boldly continued her rising crusade for women's rights. She invited Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the matriarchs of the nationwide suffrage movement, to speak in audiences in Oregon alongside her. Susan and Elizabeth were already on a nationwide tour. Elizabeth, homesick, returned to the East Coast, but Susan continued to Oregon to meet Abigail. After Susan arrived, and with a few days in preparation, the two women began to speak in Portland. Abigail and Susan's appeal to emotion, reason, and common sense helped them gain popularity. When they spoke, news of their talent and passion spread, quickly making them successful. They left Portland for Salem, Oregon City, and Milwaukee before sailing down the Columbia to speak in towns in both Oregon and Washington. "We find people everywhere seem enthusiastic and delighted," Abigail wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton during their trip. Despite their success, there was still strong opposition. After they spoke in Portland, a scathing report from the newspaper, Oregon Herald, described them as shrill, screeching women and manly. Anti-suffrage press and the church spread rumors, saying that women's suffrage would cause revolution and destruction. Abigail and Susan would maintain a lasting friendship, even after their tour ended. Encouraged by Susan, Abigail began to work closely with the national movement, eventually becoming vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Even when the two women's actions diverged, they continued to share the same fiery passion and determination for equality. They kept in touch nearly Susan's whole life, exchanging letters and advice. At home in Oregon, one of Abigail's fiercest opponents was none other than her own brother, Harvey Scott. Underneath their differing political views, Abigail and Harvey were very similar to one another. They were both gifted writers with strong opinions. But there was a crucial difference. Harvey was a man. He attended college while Abigail taught herself. She stated in her first issue of the New Northwest, "Writing was always our forte. If we had been a man, we'd have had an editor's position and handsome salary at 21. Harvey was the chief editor and part owner of the Oregonian. His authority helped defeat Abigail in her campaign for women's referendum in 1884. He frequently warned the public of women's suffrage through his newspaper. It was only 2 years after Harvey's death, in 1912, that the Oregonian declared its support for women's suffrage. By this time, Abigail had become a great influence in Oregon politics, especially in relation to suffrage and many other controversial and progressive topics. However, her methods differed from those of the Eastern suffragists. Instead of working publicly, Abigail worked behind the scenes, influencing powerful men. She was unafraid to go against the opinions of others, even those within her own social movement. A gifted and powerful wielder of words, she lacked the leadership abilities required to be part of a team, often sparking disagreement within her own organizations. Abigail was obstinate and independent. She held much value in her morals and opinions. This was evident in Abigail's work with prohibition. Many suffragists pushed to ban alcohol alongside their work for the right to vote. But Abigail, herself strictly against alcohol, believed the association of prohibition with women's suffrage was detrimental to the cause and would result in much less public support. Throughout her life, Abigail continued to fight for women's rights. She campaigned and toured the West, in California, Washington, and Idaho. Driven away and voted out of many of her organizations, she worked independently, speaking and writing as she debated for equal rights in Oregon. Abigail's talent for writing had always come naturally to her. Even without the command of an organization, she continued to inspire and persuade. Abigail became an icon in the fight for equality. She was a key speaker at the National Women's Suffrage Association Conference in 1889, and Governor Oswald West even asked her to write the Women's Emancipation Proclamation. In 1912, Abigail became the first female registered to vote in Multnomah County. After years of writing, speaking, and fighting, she finally had achieved success. Sadly, only 3 years later, on October 11th, 1915, Abigail died, a few days before her 81st birthday. While Abigail's work has come to an end, the battle is far from over. Her lifelong efforts continue to influence and affect women's rights today. The same year of her death, a woman from Oregon was elected to the U.S. Senate. 2 years later, the first female was elected to Congress. At long last, in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote nationwide. More locally, in 1991, Oregon's first female governor, Barbara Roberts, was elected into office, followed by Kate Brown in 2015.
It is time once again to set our sights on Oregon's future, to stretch our wings towards new horizons. Today is nearly half gone. Tomorrow awaits, full of promise. Now it's time to get to work. Thank you.
The years of hard work, determination, and dedication of suffragists around the country were finally being recognized. Even to this day, there are many fighting for equal treatment for women who are still being discriminated against. While Abigail helped women gain the right to vote, there was much to do in order to achieve true equality for all in America. As Abigail once said, "Every inch of this freedom was bought for them at a great price. It is for them to show their gratitude by helping onward the reforms of their own times, by spreading the light of freedom and truth still wider. The debt that each generation owes to its past, it must pay to the future." The spirit carried by Abigail and many others has persisted, inspiring new generations to work for equality and rise to power. Women like Abigail Scott Duniway have shaped the world we live in. She persevered and stuck to her opinions through difficult times, and rose above society's expectations, proving that no matter our appearances, we all have the power to change our world.